So one of the things is, what would you think would be the biggest misconception of Zen practitioners towards Nichiren Buddhism?
The biggest misconception is that we don't meditate. And and I'm not talking about just, that we don't do silent sitting,
right.
which we do as part of like Shodaigyo meditation, and some temples will offer, just silent sitting.
Yes.
At San Jose, the first Sunday of the month, we do silent sitting. But what they don't understand is that our primary practice of chanting Odaimoku, all our other practices are auxiliary or supportive
right.
of that, but our primary practice of chanting Daimoku is meditation. Nichiren calls it kanjin, seeing, that's your Dharma name, right? Seeing into the mind. That the Odaimoku is a way, can be used as a way to focus all of our attention and our energy, and is expressive of the insight that we are aiming for.
Right.
And I think they don't understand, what the Daimoku really is as far as a spiritual practice. And I kind of don't blame them for not understanding, because, when you have different lay groups who aren't so well educated.
And perpetuating certain ideas.
The idea that it's just a magical practice to get stuff.
Well, and usually with Buddhists, to be all honest, the idea of differences of practices really isn't a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
It's usually, you're a Buddhist. Well, that's wonderful. I'm a Buddhist too.
Yeah.
Whereas you have other groups that particularly are out to debate or be against certain practices, whereas we're more inclusive of them. So yeah, I think that's again, it comes down to, as we did understood last time, education.
Yeah.
That just an association, one of the misconceptions that I had seen from Zen Buddhists, especially of the self-taught,
right, the armchair school.
Armchair school that goes to some sessions once in a while. And I'm sure to Zen teachers this must be very frustrating.
They're aggravating to them too.
I'm sure. That the idea that there's no need for ceremony, no need for reciting the sutra, no need for reading the sutra.
Yeah.
Again, another extremist view.
Right.
And what did you say? Dogen said these people should be beaten with
iron rods.
Iron
and cast
rods.
into hell. Yeah.
Many people don't. Dogen's writings. Now, you did a really great series on Zen and the Lotus Sutra.
Right.
I remember that, and you had visited a Zen temple.
Yeah.
What were some of the main points that, because you were speaking to Zen practitioners, what were some of the main points that they were just blown away by concerning about the similarities?
Sutra?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's hard to say, because that was like 12 years ago.
Right. This was like, what would you remember?
I remember that a lot of them were very hung up on the idea that, did the Buddha really teach this? Are we really expected to take this, literally? Those who would even bother to read Lotus Sutra at all,
right,
or any of it. And the Lotus Sutra is a very psychedelic or apocalyptic text. Apocalyptic in a sense, not of the end of the world, but of a genre of literature that uses all kind of fantastic symbolism and revelations and heavenly beings.
More so than the practice sutras, as I call them, where there are specific practices.
Yeah, right. There's apocalyptic sutras would be like the flower garland very much, and the Lotus Sutra, and the Vimalakirti in a way, in many ways actually, as opposed to, say, a very practice-oriented discourse like the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness.
Yes. Right.
You don't have deities and towers rising out of the earth. You have this very plain, step-by-step, straightforward instruction on how to sit and what to be mindful of.
Absolutely.
You don't find that in Lotus Sutra.
Which makes it more difficult to understand.
Right.
When I was a monk, those texts, and this is, I believe, the basic Buddhism.
Yeah.
We as humans want rules. We want instruction manuals.
Right.
We want exactly not to necessarily have to deal, and sometimes leaving other religions that may be based on those kinds of apocalyptic ideas,
right,
and grandiose images.
We
tend to keep away from those, that we want exact practice. Now tell me how I can be peaceful. Tell me how I can get loving kindness. That's what I want to know.
So these people coming in Zen are looking for a more secular, kind of down-to-earth form of Buddhism. And then to realize that texts like the Lotus Sutra are actually part of their tradition.
Absolutely.
Too. That in fact, Sodoshu, and I think maybe Rinzai too, I'm not sure, they recite chapter 16. You know, not all the time, maybe not as much as the Heart Sutra, but they do recite chapter 16.
Yeah.
And they also recite chapter 25, you know, the verses on Kuan Yin.
Well, in some traditions, you know, it's actually interesting. Even Chinese Buddhism, it's a separate sutra.
Yeah, yeah, chapter 25.
Chapter 25.
Right, right.
You know, so some people very much, because in the Chinese tradition, Zen tradition, you know, Kuan Yin, and that is particularly great. As you go to most Chinese temples, that's usually the honzon, the object of worship they have, object of veneration, but they don't know necessarily it comes from the Lotus Sutra.
Right, right. So, you know, a lot of these American Zen Buddhists come into Zen with these preconceived ideas of a very rational, you know, kind of secular, non-religious kind of tradition, and then when they actually get involved in Zen, they find out that there are these other dimensions there too. And then they have someone like me come in from a very devotional tradition, reminding them of it, saying, yeah, you guys in your tradition chant this too. And this is an important text for Dogen, who quotes it more than any other sutra in his Shobogenzo.
Well, it's important.
And they don't know what to make of it. And so I spent a lot of time explaining, you know, look, you're not meant to take this literally. It doesn't matter if the historical person, Buddha, really taught this or not, or if it was anonymous monks hundreds of years later. What's important is some deep principles of what Buddhism's about are being expressed here in this very mythic and poetic way. And if you can open your mind and heart to it, you know, it can really change the way you approach your practice, approach your life. It can really revolutionize.
Approach everything. Well, you know, it's very fascinating that in coming into Buddhism, of course, the major tenets of Buddhism that people like is the kind of idea of expedient practices. The idea of one Buddhist practice, you know, kind of the many paths leading up the mountain.
Right.
All of these practices that they specifically state as being Buddhist, I realized were not necessarily from their sutras because they were practice-oriented sutras, but were being drawn, you know, and artistically from the Lotus Sutra.
Right.
You know, all of the ideas that led people to saying, okay, I'm a Buddhist because I don't believe in a particular secularized practice that one group is right, one group is wrong.
Yeah. You mean sectarian.
Sectarian, and we all have the ability, you know, to attain that. You know, the place that they specifically talk about Buddha nature and depth is Nirvana Sutra.
Right.
But the Nirvana Sutra points back to the Lotus Sutra and says, the truth in the Lotus Sutra is the Buddha nature.
Yeah.
And that's one and the same. So now we're going to talk about the parts, but you have to just, by understanding the Lotus Sutra, by that naturalness of being, believing in the Lotus Sutra is where the basis of Buddhism. So I believe most people come to Buddhism because of the tenets that are set forth in the Lotus Sutra.
Well, you know, I mentioned in the previous session about my experience with Soka Gakkai and how when I left them, I joined the One Buddhist.
Right.
And One Buddhism was founded in 1916 in Korea by a man now known as Choeizan. I think Park Chun-bin. I'm mispronouncing his name, I'm sure. But Choeizan is how they came to know him, the great master Choeizan. And he wasn't able to find a good teacher in his area, so he kind of was a self-taught Buddhist, and he attained his own awakening, what he felt was an awakening. And then he studied. He spent some time in a monastery studying the Buddhist scriptures. And he identified very strongly with the Diamond Sutra, especially.
Right.
And then he started, at first he didn't start something called One Buddhism, like a separate, he started like the Buddha Dharma Study Association. And he selected certain texts for people, just kind of re-educate them about Buddhism. And he selected the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Sutra 42 Chapters, which, as you may know, was supposedly the first sutra translated into Chinese, which is really kind of it's not really a sutra in the regular sense. It's more like a selection of lines and verses. Right. Maybe from various sutras teaching the basic teachings of the Buddha.
That was one of the first sutras they made us read, actually.
Really, yeah. And for good reason. You know, it's very much a Hinayana text.
Absolutely.
But the basic foundations are there. He also used a couple sutras dealing with cause and effect. They're also from the Agamas, for the Mahayana selection. And then he selected some Zen texts, the verses on the Oxford and Pictures, a discourse from a temple called Shushuam, a meditation, and an essay by the 12th century Zen master in Korea, Chinul. So this stuff is not about the Lotus Sutra. And you know, it's very much weighted towards the emptiness teachings and silent sitting. But he did have devotional aspects in the Master Choeizan's teaching. He taught using Nembutsu. They used some Dharanis. I don't know where they came from. I think he maybe wrote some of them himself.
Mm-hmm.
You know. So none of this is about the Lotus Sutra. But when I was with them, they emphasize things that are found in the Lotus Sutra.
Right.
You know, the universality of Buddha nature.
I from the one vehicle of universality. Yeah.
That this world is the Buddha land, not after death. And I even said to one of the teachers there, one of the nuns who was a teacher, I said, he says to people, chant Nembutsu as a, in addition to silent sitting meditation, but then he gives all these cautions about it. He says, don't just keep trying to picture Amida as a Buddha outside yourself. Don't imagine a life after death. Realize that you're calling on your own Buddha nature and this is a Buddha land. And I said, the practice doesn't match the intent. But I think that the practice of Daimoku matches the intent. And he teaches all these principles that are not found in the Diamond Sutra, but are found in the Lotus.
Right. So a lot of times, that's done to me as well. It's interesting. In the Chinese tradition, we have one of the many practices, of course, was Pure Land practice.
Yeah.
But the way that I understood the Pure Land was this world.
Yeah.
That's how I was educated. I didn't think it was a separate world.
You're given the Chan or Zen spin on the Pure Land practice.
And
right?
that's exactly how it was portrayed. That when you awakened, naturally, you would smell the incense. Naturally, you would see the Buddhas. Naturally, you would see the reality.
Yeah.
And then you would see the purity within that.
Right.
And I didn't think I was going to another magical kingdom.
Right. Right.
So that's very important. I want to say that on this on BuddhaNet .net, which is a great website resource for basic Buddhism. One of the differences of Buddhism is that it says that there is not an almighty God in Buddhism.
Yeah.
Whereas, some practices of Buddhism, let's say somebody coming from Pure Land Buddhism, a lot of times Amida Buddha is seen as of course, the salvation of people.
Right. And
also this coming, teacher.
Like the Buddhist version of Jesus.
Of Jesus.
God.
And a lot of times due to, of course, people don't understand the cultural influence of having to adapt to a Judeo-Christian culture and being able to keep some sense of your tradition.
Yeah.
They adapted that, no doubt. That was an expedient.
Yeah.
But now that seems to be the main point of them.
Well, I have the suspicion that some of the Japanese immigrants in America were taking like Christian hymns and then just putting Buddha in instead, and using that in their churches.
Well, we see that, but I of course I commend that as the adaptability of Buddhism.
Right.
I don't see it as a negative thing. But what would you say? Because our next segment is people who do not come from a Buddhist background.
Yeah.
May come from a Judeo-Christian background, or perhaps some other tradition, and come to Buddhism. But a lot of Buddhists, as you said, pick Buddhism because of its secular nature.
Yeah.
And so therefore a lot of Buddhism that has flourished in the United States,
what they think is a secular
what
rational
they think
nature,
is secular or rational, are attracted to Buddhism. So a lot of times, because of you were saying the flowery nature and also the kind of supernatural character of the Lotus Sutra, this is usually a big misunderstanding.
Yeah. So wait, what's the question then?
The question is that, so, one of the big things is that there are Buddhism, let's say now a Pure Land Buddhist.
Yeah.
A Pure Land Buddhist wants to understand Nichiren Buddhism, and as you know, Nichiren was extremely critical of that, and so therefore, he is very direct about Amida Buddha and the practice of Nembutsu, chanting Namu Amida Butsu.
Yeah. Well, I think one person that more Buddhists know about is Tiantai Juri, the founder of the Tiantai school in 6th century China. And when you read Nichiren's writings, so much of it are passages from Tiantai or one of his later successors who reformed the tradition, Miao Lo. If you took away all of the quotations of the Lotus Sutra and all the quotations from the Nirvana Sutra, and all the quotations from Tiantai and Miao Lo out of Nichiren's writings, there wouldn't be that much left.
No.
You know, what would be left would be brilliant, but, you know, there's just so much of it was him just pointing back to these guys saying, you know, look, here's where it's all set out. And what Tiantai did that was so brilliant was, that I think needs to be done again in North America now, is he took in, he had available to him all these translations of the Buddhist sutras and treatises. He lived like a few generations after Kumarajiva. So he had all the major Mahayana and pre-Mahayana, the Agamas, sutras in front of him. He had treatises like the Treatise on the Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, which is an encyclopedic work trying to sum up all of Buddhism. And he turned it into a coherent system, not just of study, you know, not just an academic system, and not just a way of rating sutras to make some sectarian claim, but he created a system that would guide practice. So you would go from the basics, basic understanding, basic practices, all the way into the depths of the Dharma.
And faith and all.
Right. So, you know, that's what we need to do now. We're at a point where we have decent translations of the most important Buddhist sutras, and some, though not all, of the most important treatises in East Asian Buddhism.
Unfortunately, Tiantai not being one of them.
Yeah, we don't. Yeah, and not the treatise on the Great Perfection Sutra either.
Right.
So, I think Bhikkhu Buddha Mitra, I think is his name. Is it Buddha or Dharma? Well, anyway, he's a monk who lives here in Seattle, and started Kalavinka Press and is translating big portions of the Great Perfection of the treatise on the Great Perfection of Wisdom. And, you know, we have all this material. Now we need to, for ourselves, for our time and period and culture, figure out how does this all fit together?
Right.
How will this meet our needs? And not just, you know, to confirm our prejudices, but to challenge us in the ways we need to be challenged, to set up a coherent system of practice and development.
Absolutely.
And fortunately, we don't need to start from scratch, because I think a lot of what Tiantai set up is still valid. Nichiren's three great secret dharmas of the Daimoku and the Gohanzan and the Kaidan precept platform,
right,
you know, is also, I think, a good guide for us now. If I didn't think that, I wouldn't be a Nichiren Buddhist.
Right.
You know, and each of those things deserves its own, maybe larger discussion. But, you know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't investigate and think through this for ourselves. I'm doing that on my blog, on my website, you know, Fraught with Peril of Ryuei. Because Fraught with Peril is actually a bunch of different bloggers. There's just one blogger on there, but, you know, on my blog, on the Fraught with Peril site, I'm writing commentaries and articles where I'm thinking through this and double checking.
Well, it's very evident, and people really like that.
Yeah.
Because they feel as if they're studying with you and not being told by you.
Exactly.
So that.
And Tiantai and Nichiren have been my guide. I'm not starting from scratch. I'm not, you know, trying to reinvent the wheel. But what I'm doing is...
You're not starting your own sect.
I'm taking, I'm not starting my own sect. I'm taking their cues and going, okay, does this really work for us too?
Right.
And, you know, a lot of it I see still pans out.
It does. It certainly does. I just become more and more impressed with the Tiantai's writings, and as I studied Nichiren Buddhism, it just led me deeper and deeper, and it gave a more solid base, and I think that's what Nichiren was directing us to do.